we can assume that they are obviously influenced to some degree by those who pay their salaries. And oftentimes that will be advertising and reprints of journals. And so we can say, yes, to some degree, the journals are influenced by those, the manufacturers who are publishing their studies in those journals. That's, it's a statement of fact. At the same time, you might argue, well, what about the academic researchers, these specialist doctors and so who are doing this research? Don't they have a level of ethics and morality that's going to prevent bad research from coming to light? And I would argue that a lot of times they do have the right ethics. They do prevent bad research from being foisted onto the population. But not always. We have, I can give you dozens of examples where major drugs studied by very respected and prestigious universities and clinicians, and the whole team has been in on the take. In on the take in the sense of they consult for the companies, they own shares in the company, they might even own rights to the patent, and so they are financially invested in the success of the drug. And sometimes they're professionally invested in the success of the drug. The drug is like a baby. They've kind of raised it since it was small. They want it to succeed. And of course, you'll do anything for your child to succeed. But what we need is this sort of untangling of the manufacturers and the research. And quite frankly, in medical journals nowadays, you can read a study and right at the very end, they will list the disclosures of all of the researchers who were involved. They will say how many shares they own, not how many, but if they own shares, if they're on the Speakers Bureau, if they're consultants or paid spokespeople for the companies. And that gives you a good sense of what their orientation is. I always go to that part first because when I'm looking at a study, I want to know if it's funded by the National Institutes of Health or Pfizer, because that influences, I think, how you should trust what they're saying in the study. Tamiflu is a very controversial case, partly because there was this huge amount of fear that we were going to have an international, a global influenza pandemic. And oftentimes the imagery was from the 1918 Spanish influenza epidemic where millions of people died from that. And that it was very, has a lot of impact on the psyche when perfectly healthy people get something as simple as the flu and then die. Now Tamiflu, the main problem with the development and the launch of Tamiflu is that it was always, it came to the market without independent evaluation of the research, right? And there were researchers within the Cochrane Collaboration, Tom Jefferson and his colleagues, who did an intense amount of work to try to get the full trial results of Tamiflu. And they fought for years to get this. And the reason why it was so important, because as this fear of a global pandemic was happening, governments around the world were stockpiling Tamiflu for, to the tune of billions of dollars. They were buying up huge lots of Tamiflu and storing it in case there was a pandemic. The question is, you would do that if you had a very effective drug. And the problem was Tamiflu was not a very effective drug. In fact, Tamiflu is something that you take when you have symptoms. The average flu might last, we'll say 5 days. Tamiflu might reduce that by 6 hours, 8 hours. So it wasn't like it was preventing the flu or even making you get better a lot faster. The research that we had known at the time was that there was a small bit of benefit. Well, when the Cochrane researchers finally got the full data set to look at the sort of value of Tamiflu, there wasn't much of a surprise because it was even less effective than we thought it was. And so here we have governments around the world who've stockpiled billions of dollars of Tamiflu, wasted huge amounts of our public healthcare dollars for a treatment that simply has almost no effect. I could talk all night about Tamiflu. Let's put it that way. I mean, it's a story, right? It's something that it was an appalling piece of work by the company and even by the regulators, because the regulators were, they're buying this stuff up because they had to do something or they had to appear to do something. Well, bought billions of dollars worth of a relatively ineffective drug. The other thing, too, you should know is that Tamiflu it's not completely benign. In fact, there were reports in U.S. newspapers just last week of suicides related to Tamiflu. So for a small percentage of people, the drug causes severe psychiatric effects and hallucinations. There were a whole series of suicides in Japan among young people taking Tamiflu. So when I say that you have to understand the benefits, you also have to understand the harms. We're talking about the simple flu here. We're not talking about polio, right? Yeah. The Cochrane Collaboration is a largely volunteer organization, 30,000 plus volunteers around the world. They're in more than 100 countries. It's been going for 25 years now. It was started in the early 90s in Oxford. It started by Ian Chalmers and other colleagues who said, we need to have an organization that can systematically look at healthcare interventions to see what works and what doesn't. Because if you don't know what works and what doesn't, how could you ever have a rational kind of health system? And so the organization grew very rapidly, funded largely by public money, and controversies along the way, including those within the Cochrane Collaboration who said we should get money from the drug industry to help do these systematic reviews, and others vociferously opposing that, saying that would taint the Cochrane message. We can't take money from the drug company. And so they have remained independent, largely. When you say unbiased, well, everything has some level of bias. Let's say, for example, if you're doing a systematic review of cholesterol-lowering drugs, but all those individual studies were funded by manufacturers, you know what they say, garbage in, garbage out. If you're doing a systematic review of garbagey studies, well, you're going to get a systematic level of probably garbage answers. I wouldn't say that Cochrane produces the most unbiased information. I would say that they're at least providing these answers to, has it been studied before? And it's an important question, because anyone who has a medical question about whether a drug works and whether it works should be asking, what does the Cochrane Library say? And the Cochrane Library is online. There are free consumer-oriented summaries. You can read what Cochrane says generally about a lot of treatments. There's lots of criticism about how valuable that is, because sometimes it's dense, it's jargony, it's a little academic. I wrote the book, The Cochrane Collaboration, because I thought this was one of medicine's best kept secrets, and that's the subtitle to my book. Even though in the research world, we've all heard of the Cochrane Collaboration, but most people in the street have never heard of Cochrane. You probably haven't heard of Cochrane. Most people haven't heard of Cochrane, when in fact, that should be probably the first place you should go if you're interested in solving a medical, if you have a question about whether a healthcare intervention works or not. And so I wanted to sort of really kind of promote, but also explore this organization. And I went to Oxford, and I went to Madrid, and I went to Paris, and I went to Quebec City to interview. I interviewed more than 160 people in the organization to really get a handle on what makes it tick, why does it keep going. Again, it's largely a volunteer-run organization, and there are many, many very well-meaning independent researchers working for Cochrane.